The man was driving down a deserted road when all of a sudden he had to slam on the brakes. Two children were huddled at the edge of the highway. A girl was holding her little brother tightly, both of them covered in dust, their faces smeared with dirt, their eyes holding a pain that was hard to look at. No one else had stopped, but he did. He stepped out of his truck. Why would a stranger choose to carry a burden that isn't his? And if it were you, would you stop? "Food is a blessing," said Lorraine Godfrey's voice, sharp as shattered glass during dinner. "It is not to be wasted. It is not to be played with. It is to be appreciated in silence." Emily Carter stared at her plate of watery beans and plain rice. Beside her in a makeshift high chair, her baby brother Noah, whom she lovingly called Noe, murmured softly. At just 10 months old, Noah didn't yet understand the language of silence. Emily lived in a state of constant alert, afraid that one of Noah's gurgles might be too loud, that his cry might rise above the droning hush and draw Lorraine's attention. The director moved through the dining hall, her heels striking the floor like the ticking of a time bomb. She never raised her voice, not once. Her punishments were worse than yelling. They were silent, just like everything else inside Brighthaven. A child who spoke out of turn lost their dinner. A child who cried was sent to the quiet room, a windowless closet from which they returned pale, hollow-eyed, and shaken. Emily shuddered and pinched her thigh under the table until it hurt. Pain kept her anchored, reminded her she was still there and that she had to be strong for Noah. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a small boy, Kevin, drop his spoon. The clink of metal on tile rang out like a gunshot in the dining room. Every head turned, the air turned solid. Kevin froze his eyes wide with panic. Lorraine stopped beside him. She said nothing. She just stood there staring. The silence stretched into eternity. Finally, without a word, she bent down, picked up the spoon, wiped it off with a napkin from her pocket, and placed it back on the table. Then her hand landed briefly on Kevin's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a mark. Emily knew Kevin wouldn't get dessert for a week. That night, as she rocked Noah in her arms in the dark of the dormitory, Emily thought of Matthew. Matthew had been at Brighthaven when she and Noah arrived. He was cheerful, one of the last kids who still remembered how to laugh. One day, during a visit from some potential adoptive parents, Matthew had refused to smile. The visitors were a bulky man wearing a gold watch and a woman who reeked of expensive perfume. Emily had seen the flash of rage in Lorraine's eyes. Later that night, she saw Edward Monroe arrive. He was the right hand of the man they only whispered about, but never saw Kurt Vogel, better known in the shadows as the Vulture, the real owner of Brighthaven. Edward wasn't silent like Lorraine. He was a brute of a man with hands like sledgehammers and a scar that ran from his brow to his chin. He didn't say a word. He just nodded at Lorraine and walked straight to Matthew's bed, grabbed him by the arm, took him away. Matthew didn't scream. Fear had stolen his voice. No one ever saw him again. The next day, his bed was empty, and Lorraine announced that he had been blessed with a new family. The memory sent a cold sweat down Emily's back. She held Noah tighter. He was all she had left in the world. Her parents were gone, or so she'd been told. She didn't remember much, only fragments of another life, a place full of colors and music. Here, everything was gray. The opportunity, or rather the sentence, came 2 nights later. Noah was restless, running a mild fever, and his crying was weak but persistent. Fearing he would attract Lorraine, Emily wrapped him tightly in his blanket and slipped through the dark hallways toward the kitchen, hoping to find some sugar water or anything to soothe him. The door to Lorraine's office was slightly ajar, and a narrow line of light spilled across the polished floor. Inside, she heard voices, Lorraine's sharp and cold, and the low, guttural growl of Edward. Emily pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding against her ribs. "The Vulture is growing impatient," Edward growled. "The client up north paid good money for the new shipment. He wants the younger ones, the healthy ones." "The older girl, Emily, is smart," Lorraine replied, her voice purely transactional. "She could be a problem. She watches too much." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. Edward let out a dry, joyless chuckle. "Problems can be solved. He doesn't care if she's scared or not as long as she stays quiet. Get both of them ready for Friday. The boat doesn't wait." "Both?" Lorraine asked, and for the first time, Emily caught a hint of something in her tone. It wasn't concern, it was accounting. "The baby's a risk. He cries. The client wants a pair, a big sister to take care of the little one. It's part of the package, costs more. "So make sure he stops crying," Edward ordered. "Friday, at sundown." Emily didn't wait to hear more. She backed away, her hand clamped tightly over her mouth to smother a sob. She stumbled and fled back to the dorm in a haze of panic. Her blood roared in her ears, drowning out Noah's faint whimpers. Merchandise, package, the boat. The words spun in her mind. They weren't going to be adopted. They were going to be sold like animals, like Matthew. The image of the terrified boy's face flashed in her mind. She sat at the edge of her bed, her body trembling uncontrollably. She looked at Noah, who had finally fallen asleep in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with innocent trust. Trust in her, his protector. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it something else had begun to burn, a cold fury hard as steel. She wasn't going to let them take her brother. She wasn't going to let them turn him into cargo. She looked out the barred window at the moon, a pale disk in a starless sky. Friday was 2 days away. Too close. They couldn't wait until Friday. No. The decision took shape in her mind, clear and absolute, slicing through the panic like lightning. She stared at the tall, barbed wire fence surrounding the playground, visible in the moonlight. She remembered the blind spot in the camera near the old oak tree. She remembered the tool shed that sometimes didn't latch properly. The fear hadn't disappeared, but now it had a purpose. Her love for her brother was stronger than her terror. They wouldn't wait for the boat. "Tonight," she whispered in the darkness, a promise to herself and to the tiny being asleep in her arms. Tonight. Once made, the decision settled in Emily's chest like a block of ice. There was no more room for trembling, for silent tears. The fear hadn't left. On the contrary, it was a living beast clawing at her insides. But now it had been channeled into a torrent of frozen resolve. Each second was a grain of sand slipping through an hourglass, counting down their doom. Her first move was toward the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed, where she kept her only possessions. Her fingers, surprisingly steady, didn't reach for extra clothes or a toy. They searched for a small photograph, its edges worn and bent. In it, a young man with a kind smile was holding her in his arms. It was her father, the only tangible proof that a world had once existed outside the gray walls of Bright Haven. "I promise I'll always take care of your little boy, Dad," she whispered so softly it barely moved the air. The photograph disappeared into the pocket of her pants, a talisman against the darkness ahead. Then she began to gather what they needed. She moved through the dorm room with the silent grace of a ghost, a skill honed over years of avoiding notice. From the laundry room, she stole 3 clean diapers and a small wool blanket thicker than her own. The greatest risk was the kitchen. Slipping through the hallway, her heart pounded violently against her chest, a torturous rhythm. The cold floor beneath her bare feet seemed to amplify every movement. In the pantry, her trembling hands grabbed a baby bottle, which she filled with water, and 2 stale rolls from the day before. It was barely anything, but it would have to be enough. The final step in the preparation was the most crucial one, Noah. She lifted him from the crib with infinite care, his small, warm body heavy in her arms. He smelled of milk and sleep. Emily kissed his forehead, a farewell to the only home he had ever known. She wrapped him tightly in both blankets, creating a snug cocoon to stifle any cries and protect him from the night's cold. Noah stirred but didn't wake. Now the first real obstacle, the dormitory door. It was always locked from the outside after Silvana's final round. But Emily had been watching. She'd seen one of the older girls, before they took her away, unlock it with a hairpin she had hidden. Emily didn't have a hairpin, but in her pocket next to the photo was a small metal clip she had found in the yard weeks ago. With sweaty hands and razor-sharp focus, she inserted the wire into the lock. The silence was so complete she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. A scrape. Another. Nothing. "Please, please work." A nearly inaudible click echoed down the hallway. The door cracked open. They were out. The yard of Bright Haven, lit by the pale, lonely glow of a single security lamp, was a minefield of shadows and open spaces. Emily knew the safe route by heart, from the shadow of the building wall to the large bougainvillea bush, then to the blind spot behind the old oak tree. She moved low, pressing Noah tightly against her chest, her own body acting as a shield. Halfway through, she froze. A deep, low growl emerged from the darkness near the kennel. Shadow, Hector's guard dog. Emily stood still, not daring to breathe. The dog growled again, not a bark of alarm, but a sound filled with hesitation. She remembered the stale bread in her pocket. With a slow, calculated motion, she pulled out one of the rolls and tossed it in a soft arc away from their path. There was a pause, followed by the sound of Shadow sniffing, then gnawing at the bread. A temporary truce. She had to hurry. At last, they reached the fence. In the moonlight, it looked like a monstrous web of metal over 10 feet high and topped with a vicious crown of barbed wire. Freedom lay on the other side, so close and yet impossibly far. She couldn't climb it with Noah. Her eyes scanned frantically along the base of the fence. Near a post, the ground had loosened, worn down by rain. There was a small gap barely big enough. With her heart in her throat, Emily unwrapped Noah, kissed him one last time, and gently pushed him through the gap to the other side. For one terrifying moment, she was alone on the wrong side of the fence, separated from her brother, who now lay on the damp, cold grass. "Don't cry. Noah, please, my brave boy. Not now." Now it was her turn. She took off her thin jacket and, with all the strength she had left, threw it over the barbed wire, creating a fragile layer of protection. She started to climb. The cold metal dug into her fingers and the soles of her worn-out shoes. The fence trembled under her weight. Her breath came in gasps, the effort burning in her lungs. She was nearly at the top. She hoisted herself to swing her leg over, and that was when her foot slipped. A sharp, burning pain shot through her forearm. A strangled cry died in her throat. She looked down and saw that one of the barbs had hooked into her skin, tearing it open. Blood welled up dark under the moonlight and dripped down her arm. Panic threatened to freeze her in place, but the image of Noah's face on the other side of the fence pushed her forward. With a violent jerk and a choked sob of pain, she broke free. She dropped to the other side, landing in a heap on the wet grass. For a moment, she just lay there breathless, her arm throbbing in agony, the metallic taste of fear on her tongue. But she was out. They were out. She scooped Noah into her arms as he began to whimper and held him tight against her chest. Freedom was an open, dark field lined with the looming silhouette of a forest. And that was when the world ripped open. A sharp, piercing sound shattered the silence of the night. The alarm. A floodlight on the roof of Bright Haven flicked on, sweeping the yard with a harsh white beam. They had been discovered. Adrenaline wiped away all pain and exhaustion. There was no more plan, only instinct. Run! Emily sprang to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her arm. She didn't run toward the road or the city. She ran toward the only cover possible, the darkness of the woods. She darted toward the tree-lined branches, scraping her face and clothes. Behind her, she could hear shouting, the furious barking of Shadow, and the bang of doors slamming open. She plunged deeper into the forest, the wail of the siren fading slightly, replaced by the pounding of her own heart like a war drum in her ears. The forest swallowed them whole, a darkness that both protected and terrified. They were free, but now they were lost, wounded, and hunted. The real escape had only just begun. The forest that had taken them in was both sanctuary and prison. Every snap of a twig beneath her feet, every distant hoot of an owl, sent icy waves of panic through Emily's body. Hours passed in miserable twilight, huddled inside the hollow of an old tree. The rush of the escape had faded, leaving behind a deep stabbing pain in her arm and a bone-deep cold that wouldn't let go. The gash, caked with dirt and leaves, had swollen and turned an angry purplish red. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer pounding the wound. By some small miracle, Noah slept through most of the night, worn out and bundled in the desperate warmth of his sister's embrace. But as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the canopy above, he woke. And with his waking came hunger. His crying started as a faint whimper, but Emily knew it would soon build into full-blown wailing, a beacon for anyone who might be looking for them. "Shh, my brave boy. Shh," she whispered, rocking him gently as she offered him the bottle with the last drops of water. "Almost there, we're almost going to find help." It was a lie, and the bitter taste of it filled her mouth. With a tight heart, knowing they couldn't stay there any longer, Emily stood up. Every muscle in her body protested. They left the forest behind, and the world that received them wasn't a peaceful field, but the filthy, chaotic edge of a monstrous city. The roar of traffic from a nearby highway was an assault on her ears that had grown used to the forced silence of Bright Haven. The air reeked of diesel-rotting garbage and the desperation of 1,000 anonymous lives. Buildings made of bare concrete towered like tombstones, their windows staring down like empty eyes that saw nothing. This was a different kind of jungle, a jungle of concrete and indifference, and she knew with terrifying certainty that there were predators here too. They began walking aimless with the only purpose of blending in, of vanishing. But they were impossible to ignore a girl with tangled hair and dirty clothes, bloody cut on her arm clutching a baby wrapped in a filthy blanket. People passed them by their faces, a wall of hurry and worry for their own lives. Some cast fleeting glances of curiosity or pity. But no one stopped. Pity didn't fill an empty stomach. She spotted a heavy-set woman setting up a fruit stand. With her heart in her throat, Emily stepped forward. "Ma'am, please," she began, her voice trembling. The woman didn't even look at her. "Get out of here, Brad. I've got nothing for you. Go beg somewhere else," she snapped, waving her away with a harsh flick of her hand. The rejection landed like a slap. Emily stepped back, her face burning with shame, and melted back into the crowd. She tried again with a man unloading boxes with a young woman waiting for the bus. The answer was always the same, a head that shook no. An averted glance, a door slammed in her face. That's when she understood they were invisible ghosts in a city full of people. They were someone else's problem. Meanwhile, Noah's cries grew louder, sharper. It was a sound that tore at her soul. Her brother's hunger felt like her personal failure, a sign of her helplessness. Fate, or maybe desperation, led them to a bustling open-air market. The air was heavy with the smell of sizzling pork, fresh cilantro, and ripe mangoes. For Emily, it was torture, her empty stomach twisted in knots. She saw stalls overflowing with mountains of food, a universe of abundance just meters away from her starvation. That was when her eyes landed on a bread stand. Sweet bread conscious horns stacked in golden sugary pyramids. The baker, a burly man with a thick mustache, had his back turned, arguing loudly with the supplier. People crowded the stand, pushing and haggling. No one was paying her any attention. A war raged inside her. The image of her father smiling in the photograph flashed through her mind. What would he say? But then she heard Noah's whimper, a weak and pitiful sound. Her brother's hunger won the battle. With her heart pounding so hard she thought it might explode, she crept up to the stand. Her hand, trembling and dirty, shot out like a snake. She grabbed a piece of bread she didn't even see which kind. The warmth of freshly baked dough shocked her cold skin. She turned and darted into the crowd, bracing for a shout, a hand yanking her back. But nothing happened. No one saw her. She had vanished into the same anonymity that had rejected her just moments before. She found a stinking alley behind some trash bins. Sitting down on the dirty ground, she leaned against a brick wall and broke the bread. She gave a small piece to Noah, who sucked on it eagerly. The tiny sounds of his satisfaction were the sweetest music Emily had ever heard. She devoured the rest in 2 bites. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a victory, a bitter, shameful victory. But that small triumph didn't last. The pain in her arm had become liquid fire, spreading through her entire body. Her head felt light and hot. A cold sweat clung to her forehead. The fever, which had been lurking beneath the surface, was now claiming her. She knew she was sick, dangerously sick, and a new terror surged inside her. If she fainted, if she couldn't keep going, what would become of Noah, who would protect him in this city of wolves? Driven by one last wave of feverish panic, she pushed herself to her feet. She had to keep moving. She had to get away. The constant roar of the highway pulled at her like a siren's call. Maybe out there on the road that led to somewhere else they'd find a way out. Stumbling more than walking, she reached the edge of a 6-lane freeway. Cars and trucks raced by at full speed, a river of metal and urgency that didn't care about the 2 small castaways at its edge. The afternoon sun beat down without mercy. The heat rising from the asphalt was suffocating. She couldn't go on. Her legs gave out. She collapsed in the dusty shoulder next to a concrete barrier. The world spun around her. It was over. They had escaped the cage only to die in the open desert. She clutched Noah tightly. His crying had faded into weak whimpers of exhaustion, and for the first time since she had decided to run, Emily allowed herself to cry. They weren't loud sobs, but silent, hot tears that carved clean streaks through the dirt on her cheeks. She wept for her failure, for the pain in her arm, for her brother's hunger, for the overwhelming and crushing loneliness of the world. She sat there at the edge of everything, watching life pass her by, completely defeated. The afternoon sun poured like melted honey over the hood of Richard's old pickup truck. It had been a long day, and profits were slim. Leaning against the side of his food truck, the rising sun, he counted the few crumpled bills and coins he had made, just enough for gas and tomorrow's ingredients. He let out a sigh, a sound carrying a weight that went deeper than muscle fatigue. He ran a hand through his dark hair, already streaked with silver at the temples, even though he was only 35. He closed up the food truck, its once colorful mural of a rising sun now dulled by road dust. Then he climbed into his personal truck, an old beat-up Ford that had belonged to his father, and started the engine. It coughed a few times before finally coming to life. His first thought, as always, was of his son. He pulled out his phone and dialed. "Hello?" answered the cheerful voice of an older woman. "Mrs. Martha, it's me, Rich. How's Jacob?" "Oh, Richard, your little champ is here trying to teach me how to play those video games of his." "I think I'm losing," she laughed. "Don't worry, ma'am. Take your time. I will, son. You be careful, all right? Thanks, really. I don't know what I'd do without you. No thanks needed. We're neighbors. Now drive safe," she said before hanging up. The road home was a shortcut, a winding rural path that passed through cornfields and rows of poplars swaying in the evening breeze. It was a beautiful road, but for Richard, every turn was haunted. 5 years ago, on a road just like this one, his life had split in two. The image of approaching headlights, the screeching tires, the deafening silence that followed it, was all burned into his memory. His Emily had vanished in an instant. Ever since that day, driving had become a painful necessity. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than needed. His eyes scanned the road with feverish focus. The fear that the road might take something else from him never truly went away. It ran beneath everything like a hidden current, everything Richard did. The food truck, the long hours, was for Jacob, to protect him, to give him the future Emily had dreamed of for their son. The setting sun filtered through the trees, casting a hypnotic pattern of light and shadow on the asphalt. The world seemed quiet, peaceful. That was when he saw it. At first, it was just a patch of the wrong color near the roadside, curled up beneath an old pepper tree. Trash. A bundle of rags. He slowed down, instincts honed by years of caution kicking in. Then the bundle moved. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't trash. It was a person. A child. She was sitting in the dust, hunched over, shielding something in her lap. Richard felt a chill snake down his spine despite the heat of the afternoon. Something was terribly wrong. A little girl alone in the middle of nowhere. His first impulse was to press the gas pedal. The voice of fear, his constant companion for the past 5 years, shouted in his mind. "Keep going, Richard. This isn't your problem. You've got Jacob. You can't take that risk. Don't get involved. The world is dangerous." He knew it better than anyone. Getting involved meant inviting disaster. His foot moved toward the accelerator, but his eyes caught the rearview mirror. For a moment, the girl lifted her head. Her face was a mask of grime and desperation. But it was the way she clung to what she held, a bundle of blankets, that took Richard's breath away. It was a posture of fierce, unrelenting protection, a guardian shielding her young. It reminded him of Emily, how she had cradled Jacob when he was first born, as if he were the anchor of her entire universe. Then a faint sound, almost lost in the hum of the engine, reached his ears. The cry of a baby. The war inside him ended. Fear was obliterated by something older, something stronger, decency. Empathy, the memory of love. He slammed on the brakes so hard the tires screeched against the pavement. The truck came to a sudden stop about 50 yards away. For a long moment he sat frozen, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. Then, with a sudden resolve, he shifted into reverse. He pulled up slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. He turned on the hazard lights, their blinking casting faint orange flashes into the dusky light, then cut the engine. The silence that followed was profound. He took a deep breath, grabbed a thick jacket from the passenger seat and a half-full water bottle, stepped out of the truck, closing the door gently behind him so as not to startle them. He walked forward slowly, hands visible like someone approaching a wounded deer. The girl, Emily Carter, watched him with wide, terrified eyes. She was ready to run. He could see the panic in her posture, the way she tightened her hold on the baby pressed to her chest. And then he saw the blood. A dirty cloth was tied around her forearm, soaked through with a deep, dark red. "Hey," he said, using the softest voice he could find. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't answer, only curled further into herself. He stopped a few feet away and lowered himself to her level, kneeling in the dust. "I'm a dad," he said, pointing to himself. "I have a son. Your arm, it's hurt." He nodded toward the wound. "I've got a first aid kit in my truck. Can I help you?" "Please." He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask who they were or why they were there. He saw pain and he offered relief. That was all that mattered. Emily stared at him for a long moment. In his eyes she saw real concern. No threat, no trap. Slowly, so slowly it was barely perceptible, she nodded. Richard returned to his truck and pulled a red plastic first aid kit from beneath the seat. He came back and knelt down again. "This might sting a little," he said gently. With a gauze pad and a little antiseptic, he began to clean the wound. The cut was deeper than it looked, swollen and surrounded by an angry red halo. The girl flinched and stifled a whimper of pain, but she didn't pull her arm away. Richard's hands, calloused from years of work, moved with surprising gentleness. He wrapped the arm in a clean white bandage. When he finished, he offered her the water bottle. She took it with her free hand and drank greedily, then carefully let a few drops fall onto the baby's lips. Richard took off his jacket and draped it over the girl's trembling shoulders. He looked at the small bundle baby Noah, whose face was pale and stained with dried tears. A deep sadness washed over him. What kind of world allowed something like this to happen? He stood up. The decision was no longer a matter of choice. It was a certainty. "Listen," he said, his voice firm but kind in the still air of the approaching night. "You can't stay here. It's not safe. Night is coming and it gets cold." He paused, making sure she understood. "Come with me. My house is nearby. There's food. There's a warm bed. You'll be safe. I promise." Emily looked at him, her wide eyes searching for any sign of deceit. She found none. Only the tired, kind face of a man who, for reasons she couldn't understand, had chosen to stop. Slowly using the concrete barrier for support, she stood up, her legs shaking with exhaustion and fever. Richard stepped forward and without hesitation took the baby into his arms. The small weight of Noah, so vulnerable, so trusting, pressed heavily against his chest. He guided the stumbling girl to the passenger door, helped her climb in, and handed her back her brother. He shut the door, a solid sound that sealed them into the small, fragile bubble of the truck's cab. He walked around, got behind the wheel, and for a moment just looked at the two castaways fate had placed in his path. Then he started the engine and pulled away from the lonely road, driving toward the light of his home. Unaware that he had just welcomed into his life both a terrible danger and an unexpected grace. The truck stopped in front of a small, simple house with sand-colored stucco walls and a tiny front yard where bougainvillea grew wild. To Richard, it was home, his sanctuary. To Emily, who stared through the passenger window, every door and every window was a potential threat. A house had been her prison once. She had no reason to believe this one would be different. "We're here," Richard said quietly. When he opened the door, the smell of home hit her, a faint scent of cilantro, morning coffee, and that indefinable fragrance of life being lived. Inside the house was modest and a bit messy. A child's toys were scattered across the living room floor. A sweater hung off the back of a chair, and on one wall was a collection of framed photos. A smiling boy with a missing tooth. A young couple hugging on a beach, the woman wearing the same kind smile as Richard. A round, older woman, Mrs. Martha Doyle, came out of the kitchen drying her hands on an apron. Her eyes widened when she saw Emily and the baby. Good heavens. "Alex, what?" she began, but stopped when she saw the expression on Richard's face and the condition of his guests. Her face immediately softened into a mix of shock and compassion. "Are they all right, dear?" she asked. "They need help." "Martha," Richard said simply. "Thank you for watching Jacob. Don't worry, I made some quesadillas. There are beans on the stove," she said, giving him a reassuring pat on the arm. She cast one last concerned glance at Emily before heading out. "God bless you," she whispered as she closed the door behind her. Now the four of them were alone, and a heavy, awkward silence settled over the small living room. Jacob, Richard's 8-year-old son, sat on the couch, watching the strangers with cautious curiosity. Emily stood in the middle of the room like a statue, frozen with fear, clutching Noah tightly against her chest. Her wide eyes, too big for her thin face, darted from shadow to shadow, tracing every exit. "You can sit down," Richard said softly. "No one's going to hurt you here." She didn't move. "Are you hungry? There's warm food." Silence. Her silence was a brick wall, thick and tall. Richard felt a sting of frustration and helplessness. How do you help someone who won't let you get close? It was Noah who finally broke the deadlock. His baby patience had run out. A sharp, demanding cry filled the room. It was the unmistakable cry of hunger. The problem was no longer abstract. It was real, loud, and impossible to ignore. The baby needed a clean diaper. He needed milk. Richard, a father to an 8-year-old, had neither diapers nor formula in the house. A wave of practical panic swept over him. He checked his wallet. Inside were 3 crumpled bills and a handful of coins. It was next week's rent money, the cash he had been saving to repair the fridge on his food truck. He looked at it for a moment. There was no choice. The decision wasn't even conscious. It was simply what had to be done. Now he faced his next challenge. He had to leave. He had to leave this terrified girl and her child alone in his home and hope she wouldn't flee the second his back was turned. "Hey," he began, choosing his words carefully. "The baby's hungry, and you need medicine for your arm. I'm going to the pharmacy. It's just down the block, open all night." He pointed at himself, then at the door. "I'll be back soon, real quick, I promise." Emily stared at him, her expression unreadable. Was this a trap? Was he abandoning her? Richard turned to his son. "Look after them, champ," he said quietly. "Just give them space, all right?" Jacob nodded, his eyes serious. With one last look at Emily, Richard stepped out and closed the door behind him. The short walk to the pharmacy was filled with a rising tide of anxiety. What if she left? What if she called the cops? What had he gotten himself into? Inside the pharmacy, the list grew quickly. Baby formula bottles, diapers, wipes, infant Tylenol, and for her antibiotics, painkillers, fresh gauze. The total on the register was alarmingly high. He emptied his wallet onto the counter. The pharmacist looked at him curiously but said nothing. Richard walked out of the store carrying the bags in one hand and an empty wallet in the other, feeling both terrified and strangely light. When he returned and opened the door to his house, he found everything just as he'd left it. Emily was still standing in the same spot. But when she saw him walk in, a nearly imperceptible tension eased from her shoulders. He had kept his promise. He came back. What followed was a quiet, methodical ritual. While Richard sterilized the bottle and mixed the formula with clumsy but determined hands, Jacob, overcoming his initial shyness, stepped forward and handed his dad a clean dish towel. It was a small gesture, the first thread in the fabric of a new, strange family dynamic. Richard handed the bottle to Emily. She took it, and for the first time, her attention left the corners of the room and focused entirely on her brother. She sat on the edge of the couch and fed Noah, who drank with desperate hunger. The only sound in the room was the rhythm of his sucking. Afterward, Richard handed her a glass of water and 2 pills. "For the fever and the pain," he explained. She looked at him, then at the pills, and after a long pause, swallowed them. It was another act of trust, small but monumental. While she ate a couple of quesadillas in silence, her eyes never leaving him, Richard prepared a nest of blankets and pillows for them on the couch. When everything was ready and the 2 kids were finally curled up together, a wave of overwhelming exhaustion swept over Richard. He sat back in his armchair watching them in the dim light. It felt like the worst part was finally over. But the relief didn't last. An hour later, a strange sound pulled him out of a light doze. It was a murmur, a feverish whimper. He approached the couch. Emily was twisting, caught in a nightmare. Her face was flushed and drenched in sweat. She murmured incoherent words. "The boat. No, Matthew. Don't let them take me." Richard touched her forehead. It was burning. Her skin was dry and dangerously hot. The infection in her arm, left untreated for too long, was waging war inside her small body, and it was winning. A wave of helplessness washed over him. He had managed to get them off the road to give them a temporary refuge, but this was beyond his control. The initial crisis of her rescue had passed, only to be replaced by a new one, silent, potentially deadly, unfolding right in the supposed safety of his living room. He realized with terrifying clarity that he was completely out of his depth. The night turned into a long and feverish blur. Richard's small apartment had become an improvised hospital room, a sanctuary under siege by an invisible enemy attacking from within. The only sound was Emily's feverish murmuring, a stream of broken words about boats and shadows, and Richard moving gently through the room. He worked in quiet exhaustion, replacing cold cloths on her burning forehead, trying to get her to sip tiny amounts of water through her cracked lips. Her body trembled beneath the blankets caught in the violent cycle of the fever. Richard felt overwhelmed. He was a cook, a father, not a doctor. Every pained whimper from the girl was an accusation against his own helplessness. In the middle of the night, Jacob appeared at the doorway of his bedroom, rubbing his eyes. His small face was filled with a worry no 8-year-old should ever know. "Dad, is she gonna die?" he whispered. The question hung in the air, heavy and terrible. Richard knelt in front of his son, placing his tired hands on the boy's shoulders. "No, buddy," he said, forcing a confidence he didn't feel. "She's not going to die. She's got a really high fever, that's all. We're taking care of her. She's going to be okay." But even as he said the words, he glanced at the trembling figure on the couch and wondered if he was lying. Toward the first light of dawn, as the gray glow began to filter through the windows, the crisis seemed to pass. Emily's trembling eased, her breathing deepened, steadied. She fell into a natural, exhausted sleep. Richard touched her forehead again. It was still warm, but the brutal heat had subsided. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He made coffee, the aroma filling the stillness of the morning. He sat down in his armchair, watching over the 3 children sleeping his son in bed, and the 2 strangers who had turned his world upside down, curled up on his couch. For a brief and fragile moment, he felt a flicker of peace. Maybe things were going to be okay. Dawn brought with it mundane needs. They were out of coffee creamer and bread. A simple domestic reason forced him to break their self-imposed lockdown. He hesitated to leave them alone even for 10 minutes. "Jacob," he said gently, shaking his son awake. "I'm heading to the corner store. I'll be right back. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone. No one okay?" Jacob nodded, his eyes still foggy with sleep. Richard stepped out into the street, the cool morning air a relief. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir, the distant sound of a radio, the smell of tortillas warming. He walked toward Mrs. Elvira's little store on the corner, feeling strangely exposed. That was when he saw him. Standing across the street near a telephone pole was a tall man, his shoulders broad like a wrestler's, his presence still and predatory. He wore a cheap leather jacket despite the rising heat. Richard recognized him instantly from the fevered descriptions Emily had murmured in her sleep, the scar. A white, ugly line that slashed across his face, pulling his mouth into a permanent sneer. It was Edward Monroe. His heart stopped, then began to pound violently against his ribs. Edward wasn't looking in his direction. He was speaking with 2 neighborhood boys, the kind who often loitered on the corner. Edward was holding a phone, and although Richard was too far away to see the details, he could make out the blurry image of a girl on the screen. Instinctively, Richard ducked behind a parked pickup truck, peeking through the edge of the dusty window. The wind carried fragments of the conversation to him. "A girl about this tall, with a baby," came Edward's rough, gravelly voice. "If you see her, there's a good reward." The word reward chilled his blood. This wasn't a concerned relative. This was a hunter, and he was offering money for his prey. Suddenly, as if sensing he was being watched, Edward lifted his head. His eyes, cold and empty like a shark, swept the street. For one terrifying second, his gaze seemed to stop right where Richard was hiding. Richard shrank back, convinced he'd been spotted. His pulse pounded in his temples, but Edward's gaze kept moving, scanning the street with professional indifference before returning to the boys. He said something else sharply and condescendingly, then turned and walked down the street away from Richard's house. Richard waited, not daring to move until Edward's figure disappeared around the corner. Then, forgetting the milk and bread, he sprinted back home. He slammed the door, locked the bolt in the deadlock, and leaned against the wood, gasping, trying to calm the panic tightening his chest. He looked around his small apartment. The morning sun was streaming in through the window, lighting up the dust particles dancing in the air. But the place no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a trap. The walls seemed like paper, the windows like vulnerable eyes. The shadow of Kurt Vogel, dark and menacing, had fallen over his home. His eyes landed on Emily, who was sleeping on the couch, unaware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. The weight of his decision hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't brought home 2 orphans. He had brought home 2 fugitives. He hadn't simply done a good deed, he had declared war on men like Edward. And in doing so, he had painted a target on his own front door and on his son's back. The question that had haunted him on the road returned now 1,000 times stronger, more desperate. What have I done, the police? He should call the police. But Emily's feverish words about the vulture and his power echoed in his mind. What if the police were bought? What if they just took the kids away, separated them, and threw them back into the very system that had already failed them so miserably he could kick them out, tell them to leave? The thought was so vile it made him nauseous. He looked at Emily's peaceful face, the unconscious trust with which she breathed in his home. He couldn't. He simply couldn't. He was trapped. The silent heroism of the rescue had morphed into the terrifying, complex reality of a siege. His act of compassion had become an act of dangerous defiance, and he had no idea what his next move should be. The feeling of being overwhelmed returned no longer from a little girl's fever, but from the pure, paralyzing fear of the monsters who now knew their prey was nearby. The days following Edward's sighting turned into a purgatory of anxiety. Richard's small house, once a sanctuary of noisy family life, sank into tense, unnatural silence. The curtains stayed drawn, leaving the rooms in a perpetual twilight. He told Jacob they were playing a new game, the quiet spy game, a poor excuse for why the TV was always on low volume, and why he jumped at every passing car, every barking dog. Jacob, with the intuition of a child who feels the storm before it hits, played along without asking questions, but his eyes watched his father with a troubling seriousness. Emily was recovering physically. The fever had broken, leaving behind a deep weakness and a porcelain-like paleness. But while her body healed, her mind was sharper than ever. She was no longer the terrified, half-delirious girl Richard had picked up on the road. Now she was a silent, keen observer. She saw the way Richard glanced out the window before opening the door. The tension in his shoulders, the way his smile for Jacob didn't always reach his eyes. She understood with a clarity that squeezed her chest that the danger was no longer just hers. It had spread to this good man and his son. The cage she had escaped seemed to be rebuilding itself around them, trapping them all. The silence between her and Richard was an abyss filled with unspoken words. He cared for her with quiet dedication, making sure she ate, that she took her medicine. She accepted his care with silent gratitude, helping rock Noah or fold clean clothes. They were 2 strangers, bound by a terrible secret, orbiting each other in a galaxy of fear. After 2 days locked inside, necessity forced Richard to leave. His livelihood, the food truck, had been abandoned since the rescue. He had to check on it, make sure everything was in order, cling to some semblance of normalcy. "Stay inside, I'm locking up," he said, his voice more tense than usual. The short walk to where the truck was parked 2 blocks away was thick with paranoia. Every face on the street looked like a threat, every car slowing down a potential danger. And then he saw it. His heart dropped to his stomach. From a distance, everything looked normal. But as he got closer, the violation became unmistakable. All 4 tires of the rising sun had been slashed. The truck now sat collapsed on its axles. But that wasn't the worst part. Over the vibrant mural of a rising sun that he and Emily had painted together, someone had sprayed a crude image in black paint. A coiled snake fangs, dripping venom, devouring the sun. The message was unmistakable, brutally clear. "We know who you are. We know what you love. We can destroy it." Richard froze. A surge of powerless rage and icy fear ran through him. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a signature. It was the shadow of the vulture tainting his only beam of hope. He returned home feeling defeated, the world collapsing inward. He had barely shut the front door when there was a sharp official knock. It wasn't the threatening bang of a thug, but somehow it felt worse. He peeked through the peephole. A woman in a blouse that looked government-issued stood on his porch with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Panic gripped him. His hands trembled as he opened the door. "Mr. Richard Walker," the woman asked. Her tone was professional, but her eyes were probing. "I'm Mrs. Carter from Child Protective Services. We've received an anonymous report regarding potential unregistered minors at this residence in what's been described as an unstable environment." Anonymous report. The words echoed in his mind. Edward, of course, it was a two-pronged attack. They were showing him they could use both street violence and the system against him. There must be some mistake, Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady. My nephews are just visiting, from Arizona. Their mother had a family emergency. They're only staying a few days. I see, Ms. Carter replied, though her expression said otherwise. Could I speak with them? They're napping, Richard lied quickly. The trip wore them out. In the bedroom, Emily had heard every word. Her heart pounded. She motioned to Jacob and Noah to stay absolutely silent, guiding them to the floor behind the bed. She knew exactly what was happening. The very system meant to protect children was now being weaponized against them. The social worker asked a few more questions, her eyes scanning the inside of the house over Richard's shoulder. Finally, she stepped back, but not without leaving a veiled warning. We'll be in touch, Mr. Walker. We need to make sure all minors here are being properly cared for. The moment the door closed, Richard's composure collapsed. He leaned against the wood, running his hands over his face in despair. It was over. His livelihood was destroyed in the street, and now social services were threatening to take not only the children he was trying to protect, but possibly even his own son. The gratitude he'd felt for finding them on the side of the road had turned into terror. He had led them into a worse trap, one where he was now both their jailer and their fellow prisoner. He felt a small hand on his arm. He looked up. Emily was standing in front of him. Her face was pale, but her eyes for the first time held no fear, only a fierce, unshakable resolve. She had seen the vandalized truck through the window. She had heard the conversation with the social worker. She had seen the desperation etched into the face of the man who had saved her. And she knew that silence was no longer an option. Silence was a luxury they could no longer afford. His name is Edward, she said. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, but clear as a bell in the quiet room. Richard stared at her, stunned. The man with the scar, she continued. And once she started, the words poured out like water bursting through a dam. He works for someone they call the Vulture. The woman who runs the place is named Lorraine. The place, they call it Bright Haven. She sat on the floor in front of him, her eyes locked on his, and she told him everything. She spoke of the silence, the cold meals, the haunting stares from visiting adults. She told him about Matthew, her friend who disappeared just for not smiling. She told him about the ship, about the merchandise, about the conversation she had overheard, the one that had pushed her to run. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't tremble. She spoke with the terrible clarity of someone who had seen hell and returned. What she gave Richard was the only weapon she had, the truth. When she finished, a different kind of silence filled the room. It wasn't the silence of fear or discomfort. It was the silence of shared knowledge of a battlefield that had just been drawn. The distance between them was gone. Richard looked at this 13-year-old girl who had endured more horrors than he could even imagine, and he felt his own fear transform. He was no longer just an overwhelmed man. He was now a protector. And finally, he knew the names of the monsters he was up against. The silence after Emily's confession, heavy with truth, was even denser than fear. Richard looked at her, not as a child, but as a survivor, a witness, and felt his despair crystallize into something sharp and solid determination. Thank you, Emily, he said, his voice steadier than it had been in days. Thank you for trusting me. You're not alone in this anymore. We're not alone. For the first time, he saw a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. An alliance had been forged. That very night, Richard knew hiding would be a guaranteed defeat. The walls of his house were a trap. He had to build stronger walls, not made of bricks, but of people. He first sought the guidance of Pastor James at the neighborhood church. Under the seal of confession, he told him everything. Evil thrives in silence, my son, the priest said with a voice both sorrowful and steel-bound. These vultures think they hunt in the shadows. Our duty is to shine a light so bright they have nowhere left to hide. The community is your strength, Richard. With his heart a little lighter, his next stop was the hardware store owned by Mr. Thomas Grant, the retired police officer. Grant listened at first with a kind of skeptical edge that slowly shifted into tactical thinking. Human trafficking, he growled. You're right not to trust the local cops. What they did to you, the vandalism, the social services, that's professional intimidation. These guys have one weakness: they feed off fear. But they don't know what to do with people who aren't afraid. We'll show them we're not afraid. That night, Richard's living room filled with an unusual gathering. Pastor James, Mr. Grant, the ever-loyal Mrs. Martha Doyle, and 2 market vendors, quiet, strong men who had known Richard for years. After laying out the situation, Richard turned to Emily. "Emily," he said gently, "would you tell them what you told me?" All eyes turned to her. Emily took a deep breath, and with a voice that grew stronger with every word, told them everything about Bright Haven, about Lorraine Godfrey, about what happened to her friend Matthew, about the ship. She wasn't asking for pity. She was giving testimony, one that chilled every person in the room to their core and solidified their resolve. "We can't fight them with our fists. We'd lose, Mr. Grant said when she finished. "But we don't need to fight. We just need to stand, visible, together. We'll show those bastards this isn't a frightened man's neighborhood. It's our neighborhood, and we'll defend it." The plan was dangerously simple. Wait. The next day, the community prepared its silent defense. Mrs. Doyle and her friends knitted on the porch, their needles moving with defiant rhythm. Mr. Grant swept the sidewalk with deliberate slowness, eyes scanning everything. Pastor James walked the church perimeter, rosary in hand. By mid-afternoon, a black car came to an abrupt stop in front of the house. Edward Monroe stepped out, followed by another thug wearing his usual crooked smile twisted further by the scar across his face, expecting to find a frightened man. But he froze. The street wasn't empty. Pastor James turned to face him. Mr. Grant rested his broom against the wall and crossed his arms. The knitting needles paused. At the far end of the street, the butcher and the baker stepped out of their shops, watching in silence. No one shouted, no one threatened, no one held a weapon. They were simply there. A dozen ordinary people stood together, forming a human wall stronger than any brick. Their silence was a roar that said, "We see you. We know who you are. You don't belong here." Edward glanced from one face to another, and his smirk faltered. He was searching for fear, his favorite currency, but all he found was judgment and quiet resolve. He could intimidate a man, but not an entire neighborhood. His power, built on isolation, dissolved under the light of day. Powerless, he spit on the ground, barked an order at his accomplice, and climbed back into the car. They drove off at full speed. No one cheered as the car disappeared. The relief came as a collective breath. Mrs. Martha Doyle crossed the street and hugged a trembling Richard. They hadn't won through violence, but with something far more powerful: community. For the first time, Richard felt the unshakable strength of us. The line had been drawn in the sand, and together they had refused to step back. The silent victory on the street left behind a fragile sense of calm. That night, the small group of allies knew the confrontation had only been delayed. It was Mr. Thomas Grant, the retired police officer, who voiced what everyone was thinking. "We won a battle, not the war," he said with his usual pragmatism. "We caught them off guard today, but they'll be back. The difference is, now we have something we didn't before: credibility. It's time to act, but we can't go to the local precinct. I know someone in the city, a detective from the Special Victims Unit. Her name is Lorraine Campbell. She's the best. If anyone can help us, it's her." The next day, Mr. Grant arranged a discreet meeting in the back room of the Willow Creek Library. Richard arrived with Pastor James Carter, solemn, and a nervous Emily Carter clinging to his hand. Detective Campbell turned out to be a young woman with sharp eyes and a professional energy that inspired trust. Ignoring the adults at first, she knelt down to speak directly to Emily. "Hi, Emily. I'm Lorraine," she said gently. "I heard you're very brave. I'd like to hear your story, only if you're ready." That simple gesture of direct respect was the key. Emily looked to Richard for strength and found it. For the third time, she told her story, but this time was different. With newfound courage, she spoke not just of the horror, but of the critical details. She remembered a logo of an anchor entwined with a snake printed on boxes, the name of a port she'd heard Lorraine Godfrey mention. Port Haven, and the foreign accent of the man they called the Vulture. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a witness. Detective Campbell listened, her expression tightening with each word. There was no doubt in her eyes, only a steady, controlled fury. "I believe you, Emily." Every word she said with unwavering conviction. "And I promise you, we are going to stop these people." Then she turned to the others, her tone now focused and tactical. "Her testimony changes everything. The logo matches a shipping line we've been tracking. The ship is real. They have a scheduled shipment on Friday. We've got less than 48 hours. The plan came together quickly. They would place Brighthaven under surveillance. She asked Richard and the community to act as usual, to be her eyes on the ground. Friday night unfolded like a choreography of stealth and force. From an apartment across the street, Richard, Mr. Grant, and Pastor Carter watched as unmarked vans surrounded the fake orphanage. SWAT teams moved in through the darkness and within minutes stormed the building. They saw Lorraine Godfrey being dragged out, her face twisted with rage. They saw Edward pinned to the ground. And most importantly, they saw the other children, scared but safe, being wrapped in blankets by paramedics. Emily, who had insisted on being there, watched from the window, tears of overwhelming release streaming down her face. But the operation wasn't over. A ledger found in Lorraine's office held the final piece. It didn't lead the police to a hideout, but to a luxury penthouse in the heart of the financial district. While one team secured the rescued children, another moved in to cut off the head of the snake. The arrest of Kurt Vogel, also known as the Vulture, was swift and anticlimactic. The man who had orchestrated so much suffering was found in a silk robe sipping champagne, completely stunned that his untouchable world had collapsed. The next morning, the news confirmed a total victory. They showed the faces of the criminals, and more importantly, the safety of the rescued children. Detective Lorraine Campbell paid them one final visit, her face tired but glowing. "It's over," she said, speaking especially to Emily. "The entire network is in custody. Thanks to you, Emily. You are a hero." Later, in the quiet of the living room, while Jacob and Noah played on the floor, Richard knelt in front of Emily. "Did you hear that?" he said softly. "It's really over, Emily. The bad people can't hurt you anymore. Never again." She looked at her brother, babbling happily. Then she looked at Richard, the man who had stopped his truck and changed her world. And for the first time in her memory, a genuine smile, wide and free of all shadow, spread across her face. It was the smile of a girl who, after a long and terrible winter, had finally been given back her spring. The nightmare was over. A year had passed. A year that had slowly woven a new life out of threads of patience, routine, and unconditional love that had healed the deepest wounds. The truck, the rising sun, was no longer a symbol of struggle, but the vibrant heart of the neighborhood plaza. Its mural of the sun, once defaced, had been lovingly restored by Richard, Jacob, and Emily, and now it shone with an intensity that testified to their resilience. The business was thriving, but more importantly, it had become a gathering place for the community, a space of warmth and welcome. The operation was no longer run by one man alone. Jacob, now 9 years old and full of a sense of importance, took down orders for fruit drinks. Emily, about to turn 15, moved with a confidence and lightness that made her nearly unrecognizable. The ever-vigilant child had vanished, replaced by a teenager who laughed out loud with her school friends and helped with a genuine smile. The way she looked at Noah was no longer that of a desperate protector, but of a big sister filled with a calm, playful affection. And Noah, nearly 2, was a whirlwind of joy. A sturdy little boy who had learned to walk between the tables of the plaza, always under the watchful eye of Mrs. Martha Doyle, the group's official grandma. His world held no memories of Brighthaven. It was built from the safe arms of Richard, the tickles of Jacob, and the songs Emily now sang aloud. At the center of it all, Richard worked the hot grill with a deep sense of peace. Often he would lift his eyes and take in the scene, his 3 children, the laughter, the life. The pain of losing his wife Emily would never completely fade, but it was no longer an anchor. Now it was a tender scar, a reminder of a love that had taught him how to love so fiercely. By building this new family, he had honored the one he had lost. At dusk, after the last customer had gone, Richard began his favorite ritual. Instead of closing up and heading home, he brought out a small folding table and 4 chairs. He set them up on the lawn beside Noah's playpen and served the best tacos of the day on real plates. This was his table, the table for 4. They sat together as the sky turned shades of rose and orange. The conversation was a cheerful mix of Jacob's school jokes and Emily's teasing. It was a scene of perfect, almost miraculous normalcy for a family not born of blood, but forged in the fire of compassion. Mr. Thomas Grant and Pastor James Carter passed by during their evening walk, offering smiles that were silent blessings. When they were alone again in the soft twilight, Emily rested her head on Richard's shoulder. It was a small, casual gesture, full of a trust that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "Thank you, Alex," she whispered. She didn't need to say more. The thank you was for everything, for stopping the truck, for the clean bandages, for the locked door, for standing up to the monsters, for giving her a home. Richard wrapped his arm around her shoulders. He looked at his 3 children bathed in golden light. He looked at his humble food truck business, and he realized that the rising sun had fulfilled its name in a way he had never imagined. It had never just been about selling food to get by feeding his community, by opening his heart and his home. He had nourished his own starving soul. By giving shelter to these children, they in turn had saved him from the shadows of his own grief. "You're welcome, sweetheart," he replied softly. "You're welcome." They stayed like that, the 4 of them together, a silhouette against the last traces of the setting sun. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A quiet promise of all the sunrises to come, of all the meals shared, of all the laughter that would fill the days of their new life. A table for 4 under a sky full of stars, in a world that, despite all its darkness, still had room for grace and for new beginnings. There are moments in life that arrive without warning, but carry the power to change the destiny of an entire family. Richard wasn't anyone special. He was just a single father doing his best every day to provide for his son. But when he stopped his truck in front of 2 children sitting lost by the side of the road, he did something not everyone has the courage to do. He opened his heart, opened his door, and opened his whole life to protect 2 small souls, unrelated by blood but equally deserving of love. This story isn't just about a little girl and her baby brother escaping cruelty. It's living proof that a heart capable of compassion can defeat even the darkest forces. Those who harm others will sooner or later face the consequences. And the good ones, even the quiet or lonely, will always receive their reward in the form of love renewal and a home no power can take away. What would you do if one day you found a child sitting by the side of the road trembling in fear? Would you keep driving or would you stop? Share your answer in the comments. Maybe your reflection will be the spark that lights someone else's way tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart to show your support for those who bravely choose to stand by the most vulnerable. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep hearing more stories where good people get what they deserve and evil has nowhere left to hide. How are you today? Has your day been peaceful? Thank you for being here. And thank you for continuing to choose love.